The northeast of Asia is an increasingly hostile environment. It's Russia
has carried out one of the deadliest strikes in months.
North Korea.
This is one of the most powerful missiles we've seen North Korea test.
And most crucially, China.
Tonight, the drumbeat of war.
China poses the most consequential threat to the nation's national security.
Three authoritarian regimes that are coming closer together with a shared distrust, even disdain of the United States.
Imagine the Cold War was Europe the front and Asia was the back. Now, highest tension is in East Asia, where China and America are kind of seeing each other eye to eye. There's a lot going on in the back theater, including Ukraine. But the real story here for the 21st century is China versus the US.
In the middle of all this is South Korea and Japan, two crucial American allies.
Japan and South Korea haven't always gotten along. In fact, they've got a pretty hostile history. But the two are now coming together over a mutual concern about the degrading security environment. And a key thing that unites them, that gives them a sense of security, is their alliance with the United States.
So, who runs that country matters a lot. And with an election just around the corner, how high are the stakes for this region?
It's very high because US is essential.
Trump presidency was one that was built on chaos in many different ways. And of course, not all of it was bad. The perception is that a Kamala Harris presidency will be in many ways a continuation of the Joe Biden administration.
The US presence is particularly strong in this region. Here in Japan, there's the biggest contingent of US troops outside America, a bulwark against a rising China and a nuclear North Korea. What if the US decided to pursue an America First policy? Would it leave its allies here exposed and unprotected? Okay, to understand why the US election is so important, we first need to have a quick look at the state of play here in Asia. This is a region of ancient rivalries, but the threat of major conflict is intensifying now, with the biggest military build-up since the Second World War. The outcome of the US election will have real consequences for this region.
In the north, we see a brutal dictatorship.
I had a great relationship, as you know, with President Xi. He's a very smart guy.
Could North Korea's nuclear program be given a free pass? Could China be given the room it needs to absorb Taiwan, or even more?
China is the region's emerging superpower with a ballooning military budget to boot. In just 10 years, it's almost doubled from an estimated $164 billion US dollars to $296 billion. The US military budget is still much bigger, but China has a home ground advantage, with its power concentrated close to home. And it's arguably getting more bang for buck with lower domestic costs. Its number of Navy ships has passed the US military's, and the gap will continue to widen.
China wants more control of the region and is flexing its military might in the sea and air.
China's heavy presence in the disputed region is putting the US and its allies on notice.
China claims around 90% of the South China Sea, an area rich with oil, gas, fishing grounds, and a critical trade route connecting Asian manufacturing to the world. To reinforce its claim, China's built 4 major air bases, but its claim overlaps with those of its neighbours. For example, this is the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Under international law, the Philippines has exclusive rights to the resources here, not China. It's already led to high-profile clashes like this.
Tension between China and the Philippines reaching a boiling point.
They blast the boat with water cannons.
Chinese Coast Guards pushing back against the Philippines as they try to reach disputed territory.
The general public is very concerned because we live in a neighborhood where we just can't move out. It would have been good if we could just do business as usual, but every day, every moment, Chinese aspirations is making that harder and harder.
Then there's Taiwan, the little island that was once part of the old Chinese Empire. But when the communists won the civil war on the mainland, they failed to take it. Today, Taiwan's a self-ruled democratic island, It might be small, but it's hugely important as the maker of most of the world's advanced microchips that go into everything from phones to cars to high-tech weapons. The Chinese Communist Party has long wanted to go the final step and take Taiwan, saying it's always been part of China.
Taiwanese TV showing rockets launched from the Chinese coast towards the far side of the Taiwan Strait.
This isn't an isolated problem. If China follows through on its claims of sovereignty over Taiwan, it'll likely create a conflict that'll draw in the region.
And here's why. America and its allies have built a wall of military bases that contains China. Japan hosts more US troops than any other country. In the Philippines, the US is expanding its bases for training and rotational deployments. And of course, there's South Korea, with some 23,000 active personnel and the US's biggest overseas military base.
South Korea is located in a very important geographic location. It's right between Japan and China. There are military bases all over this country, which serves US interests as well, not just for North Korea, but also for any sort of contingency in Taiwan.
Suddenly, the question of whether the US would go to war with China to defend Taiwan has become something more than a diplomatic parlor game.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes,
You are.
that's the commitment we made.
But would that change under a new president?
I think for us it's easier to have a Harris government because there's a predictability. With Trump, you could have big surprises, both good and bad. Maybe he wouldn't really care what happens to Taiwan. That is a possibility.
When Trump was president, he had a very aggressive foreign policy, especially toward allies. His presidency was, again, one of chaos. He would change policies at the drop of a hat. So really, it depends on what his current mood of the day is.
If there's one issue that seems to get Donald Trump really riled up, it's the idea that allies are taking advantage of the US military, that America's getting a bad deal. Now, much of this frustration is directed towards European nations who don't pay 2% of their GDP into defence, something they're meant to do under NATO.
They paid billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars when I said, either you pay up or we're not going to protect you anymore.
Japan has also long kept its military spending at a minimum, but is now in a rush to change that. For years, Japan's military spending was only around 1% of GDP, but already it's hit 1.6%, and it aims to hit 2% in just a few years.
I think there is a big possibility that Trump will be asking Japan to increase its defense budget, which we are going to do anyway.
Japan's shoring up new military bases on its far southwestern islands and buying missiles from the US that, for the first time, will enable it to strike mainland China. So Japan should avoid the wrath of Trump, unlike Europe.
The threat to pull out US troops from Japan, it's not as believable as other places, because I think the American bases here in Japan is very important for US ability to send its troops around in the world. Donald Trump is capable of anything, but I cannot imagine the whole kind of US defense establishment allowing him to do that.
In South Korea, it's a much different situation. The country doesn't lack defence spending, coming in at 2.7% of GDP, largely because North Korea is right next door. But as president, Donald Trump wasn't happy with that.
One of the first things that Donald Trump demanded was an increase in South Korea's contribution to defense joint cost sharing.
And President Trump has again pressured South Korea to pay more.
4 times more.
Paying for the military to defend another nation that's 8,500 miles away.
Whenever he made these demands, the perception was that it's no longer an alliance, but rather a protection racket. He also threatened that if South Korea does not pay up as much as he wanted, then it's possible that the US would completely withdraw all of its forces from South Korea.
In this election, Donald Trump is running on the same platform.
We help Korea come back from the Korean War. It's time we stop. They're a money machine.
But what also worries allies is the bizarre relationship between the former president and South Korea's greatest threat, the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. It began relatively normally with threats and missile tests.
A long-range missile like this is so concerning.
The rocket came down in the Pacific Ocean.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Then Donald Trump tried diplomacy, negotiating to stop North Korea going nuclear.
Big progress.
But there was no deal. In fact, the whole thing was a flop.
They exchanged a lot of niceties, but unfortunately that did not come to any kind of fruition.
Donald Trump eventually did squander it because of his utter lack of preparations and foreign policy foresight.
Then things got very strange.
And then we fell in love, okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters.
Under President Biden, the US approach to North Korea returned to its usual firm line.
A nuclear attack by North Korea will result in the end of whatever regime were to take such an action.
As long as the North Koreans weren't bombing anyone, Biden had other things to worry about. He was much more worried about what was going on in Ukraine, in the Middle East. And so regarding North Korea, there's not been any sort of progress whatsoever.
But in the lead up to the US election, North Korea has launched a flurry of ballistic missile tests, vowed to exponentially increase its nuclear warhead stockpile, makes regular threats against the US, South Korea and Japan, and has entered a new alliance with Russia.
When we get back, I get along with him. He'd like to see me back too. I think he misses me.
I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump.
If Vice President Harris becomes president, I believe she might want to try to negotiate with North Korea. But the North Koreans have rejected all these overtures, claiming that the only way for them to come back is to be recognized as a nuclear power state and for all sanctions to be relieved, which is not going to happen.
There's also the fear that Trump is going to think to himself that North Korea is an issue that he left unfinished and he want to go back to it. Now, if he does, the fear is, will South Korea be part of the negotiations or will it be sidelined? If it is sidelined, what kind of talks or what kind of concessions will the US make and how will that affect South Korea's security?
Deterrence is a word you hear a lot in security circles, and the idea is that you prevent war by showing you can and will put up a fight. Now, North Korea can't win against the US, but China, well, as it gets stronger, it'll keep re-evaluating the situation. And sure, the US and its allies can continue to beef up security, but there's another tactic, and that's to squeeze the Chinese economy. But it has to be done carefully. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe was exposed as overly reliant on Russia for gas. The US, which relies heavily on Chinese products and supply chains, doesn't want to be caught in a similar predicament.
We are for de-risking, not decoupling with China.
So it's restricting business with China.
He ended up selling American chips to China to help them improve and modernize their military.
So I took in billions and billions of dollars, as you know, from China.
But it's also asking those allies, Japan and South Korea, to restrict their business with China as well. And for them, that's a tough ask.
The fear is not about an outbreak of hostilities, but rather it is about how that containment or the decoupling or whatever word that we like to use is pursued.
Both Japan and South Korea will be crucial in making sure the US manufacturers can still get the microchips they need if a conflict over Taiwan were to occur. But they're also nervous about Donald Trump's aggressive trade policies, promising to put tariffs on pretty much everything.
Under my leadership, we're going to take other countries' jobs. We're going to take their factories.
And even criticising South Korea as he demands the US imports less and produces more.
Sure, it's an ally, but you know, on trade, it's not an ally. In trade, it's an enemy.
While Harris is also keen to please the unions and bolster domestic manufacturing.
China is not moving slowly. They're not. And we can't afford to either.
Never kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. So Korea is the goose that is laying the golden egg. You need to make sure that we don't, just crumble under these protection acts within the United States, because it might be good on the short term, but in the long term, it'll be devastating for the U.S. economy.
China will continue to grow. The question is how much the US and its allies will contain it, diplomatically, economically, militarily. At the same time, North Korea shows it has no intention of curtailing its nuclear ambitions. Regardless of who wins the US election, how the next president of the United States responds to these challenges will shape the 21st century.
The role of the US president is to secure and take care of the American people. I just want to say that South Korea and other allies are required for the interests of the United States. And so whatever the outcome, I'm hoping that the alliances will be much more appreciated.